So, Joel, the books of Joshua and Judges are the first two books in what we call the Deuteronomistic History.
Yeah, it feels like when you're reading that it's a continuation of the story we've just had. You know, we knew Joshua was going to take over from Moses. That was the end of Deuteronomy. And Moses has just died. And now what's left is to enter the land, which is sort of the last remaining promise unfulfilled from all the way back in Genesis. But we, scholars, read Deuteronomistic history, that is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and think that we're looking at a different literary entity. Not that there's not continuity in the plot, in the characters, indeed probably in some of the underlying sort of literary materials that make it up. But there's something about the Deuteronomistic history that has a particular editorial bent to it, even when it's full of stuff that otherwise doesn't really go together.
And this will be quite obvious in some of the passages, especially in Judges, where they will say, you know, Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And this runs like a refrain. It's their way of linking episodes together.
Yeah, I mean, you get it right at the beginning of Joshua, where the first thing that happens is the announcement that, okay, now it's time to go conquer the land, but we better make sure that we follow the Torah. Right, which is a thing that was never really brought up before, but is now going to come up over and over again.
And then when we get to the end of the book of Joshua, we have a big covenant renewal ceremony, so that, and in fact, this is really how I was taught the Bible back 50 years ago, was that this was in fact the implementation of the revelation on Sinai.
Yeah, there's definitely continuity and there's some bookending going on here. But it's the notion of the imprinting of Torah and obedience onto what is really a history or histories of the conquest of the land.
Yeah. Now, the first problem that hits one with this is that most of us nowadays believe that at least the book of Deuteronomy wasn't produced until several hundred years later than the events that are supposed to be described in the books of Joshua and Judges.
Yeah, once you figure out that this entire sweeping history from Joshua all the way through the end of Kings probably at least was given its final editorial shaping, you know, by a single hand, then we can ask the question of, well, when was that person working? And we know the answer because the history of Israel ends. Right, it ends at the end of Book of Kings. It ends in the middle of the exile.
Yeah.
It doesn't go further than that. So that's approximately when this work comes from. So it's an exilic product, which of course is many hundreds of years later than the events, at least at its beginning, that it purports to describe.
And we could also figure that out from the fact that Deuteronomy seems to be, to some degree, modeled on Assyrian treaties, and therefore, and even the usual theory of it, that it was produced in the time of Josiah, that everybody might subscribe to that anymore, but it wasn't earlier than that.
Right, and the reason that that's important, of course, is because we call this history that Joshua and Judges are the first part of, we call it the Deuteronomistic history, because the theological underpinning of the ideology of the whole thing is, let me take what Deuteronomy said about following the Torah and centralizing worship and not worshiping foreign gods, and then let me explain the whole history of Israel through that lens. Right? Why were they able to conquer the land? Because everyone obeyed. Why did stuff go wrong in the book of Judges? Because they stopped obeying, right? And so on all the way through. So the timing and dating of Deuteronomy is important for understanding the timing and dating of Joshua and Judges, because Deuteronomy has to come first. So when Deuteronomy is 7th century, 8th century, somewhere in there, 6th century. It's in any case, it becomes relatively difficult to say, oh, the book of Joshua was an eyewitness account of the book of Joshua.
Right. Now, but the material that makes up this Deuteronomistic history, while it has a clear editorial layer, there's a fair bit of diversity. And even, in fact, if you compare the two books that we're going to be talking about, Joshua and Judges, Joshua reads like a very systematic kind of book in many ways. Some of it strikes me as almost priestly. There's emphasis on ritual, but it's very well organized. Whereas when you get into Judges, these are collected stories.
Yeah, and not just that, Not just, there's obviously diversity in genre between the two, but also there's what seems to be fairly straightforward contradiction. In terms of the basic question for both of these books is, how is it that Israel came to conquer and possess the land of Canaan? And as you said, Joshua in its systematic way says, they walked in here, and then they went here, and then they went bang, 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 bang. He gives a whole list of all the kings, and then they divided all the land, and it was done. And you get to Joshua, and they're like, and then there was some stuff that we left over. But it will say, but they hadn't conquered Jerusalem, even though in Joshua, I could point to you the verse that says, and they conquered the king of Jerusalem. So what you have here is, in this history, it's not unlike a modern historian taking a variety of older sources and weaving them together into a new sort of thought out history of the thing, except that the sources don't agree with each other, and the historian who's putting them together doesn't really care very much about that, it seems.
So it seems. This is the striking thing about it. I think, if we're looking at a modern work of history where somebody is using diverse sources, you expect them to try to work out some of the kinks. And in fact, later on in the biblical tradition and the Jewish and Christian tradition, people did try to work out some of the inconsistencies. But really not here.
Not here, and as we know, not in the Pentateuch, where it's even more pronounced through a way, and not here. Here, I think, they're simply not that interested in working out, in getting a smooth story, because the historian is so focused on proving his point, which is obedience means good things and disobedience means bad things, that he'll take any story that he can work into that scheme, even when the stories themselves don't really go together. Nobody walks away from the Deuteronomistic history going, I wonder whether obedience or disobedience is good, right? Like you get the point, even as the details may be a tiny bit fuzzy.
Yeah. Now, where you have older sources like this, you have, in principle, the possibility of historical memories. Do you figure that's much of a factor in a book like Joshua?
So, what I think is so interesting is I don't know that I would say historical memories. I would say attempts to understand historically things that they were seeing around them and had seen around them. The best example of this that we always talk about, of course, is the state of Jericho, which at the time that this was written was a pile of ruins for the most part, and had been for centuries. And you can sort of see in the texts not them remembering something historical about the fall of Jericho, but generations probably of attempts to explain why is Jericho a giant pile of ruins, right? And their answer, to their own credit, is we did that, way back in the day.
Yes, and even more so then with the next story after that, which is I.
Right.
Which means
the city which means pile of ruins, right?
So, there was probably something there to spark the story. Now, when the interest in separating fact from fiction became strong or finally hit biblical studies, which I guess was first maybe in the 19th century, to a very limited degree before that, and then in a big way in the 20th century. So the main method people had for separating fact from fiction was archaeology. Because in principle, you would think if the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, if you dug in the right place, you ought to be able to find them.
Yeah, people went out, as I said, with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other, trying to find evidence for these biblical stories. And Joshua, because it's full of cities being destroyed, and because destructions of cities are wonderfully easy to see in archaeological records, people went nuts looking for proof. And Jericho was really because we've always known where it is, one of the easy cases. And one of the first times that I think people sat up and said, I don't think it works.
Yeah, actually the first time they dug it, I think, they assumed it worked. And they assumed that when they found evidence of destruction, that must be the biblical one. And then Kathleen Kenyon came along in mid-century and said, oops, no. By then, there was a method of dating things by pottery and other controls, comparing things from different sites. And suddenly, the consensus was that Jericho hadn't been inhabited for several hundred years.
Yeah.
And we're assuming here, of course, that the events that we're talking about should have happened in the 13th century.
Right, that would be when the biblical sort of dating scheme would put it. You know, the real issue, I think, along with the archaeology, is that it's not just that Jericho doesn't work. I think at this point, we're pretty much convinced that the whole conquest didn't happen, right? I mean, that I think is where most scholarship is at this point. And Jericho was the first, sort of the first city to fall, as it were.
This was one of the most enjoyable debates in biblical scholarship in the 20th century.
Would that I had been alive for it.
Because at a certain point in time, we had a school of people who dubbed themselves the minimalists, who were pretty much devoted to denying that anything happened.
Yeah.
And there were a number of Scandinavian scholars involved in this, and a British scholar named Philip Davies. And then there was an American archaeologist named Bill Deaver who took it upon himself to defend the tradition. But then, when he worked through the evidence, he said, well, when you look at it, the Exodus didn't happen. No evidence of Egyptian culture being imported into Canaan. Joshua, no, all the major sites in Joshua, there's some problem with the dating of them, and besides internal contradictions.
Yeah.
And so finally he said, but Judges corresponds amazingly well to the facts on the ground, which led me to wonder, had he found the jawbone of an ass somewhere in a pile of Philistine? Because, you see, Judges doesn't actually give you the kind of verifiable, non-verifiable events that you get in Joshua. So what he meant was, this probably gives you a sense of what the society was like at some point, but it didn't refute the minimalists in the way that Bill Deaver had hoped it would.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a stage now, I think, where we recognize that both Joshua, more clearly Joshua, but also Judges, are, as is so often the case, later Israelite attempts to understand a part of their own myth, a part of their own story. They had, the myth of the story of the conquest of the land, the taking over, which, again, we think there's not any good archaeological evidence for. You can see multiple attempts to work out, how did we get here, and where did the people go who were here before us? And so much of Joshua and Judges is about exactly that question. Where did these people go that we're supposed to have conquered?
Are we any the wiser on that question now, after 100 years or so?
Where did the people go?
Yeah, and how did the Israelites come to be there?
Well, I think we are a little bit wiser in terms, at least, of the second part. I think there's a relatively good consensus, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think there is, that the nation of Israel emerged not from an external conquest after a departure from Egypt and coming around from the east and across the Jordan, but rather almost certainly over many centuries and many generations, essentially migrated internally within what we now call Canaan, Palestine, Israel, from the large city-states on the coast and in the sort of the fertile hills, up to the not so nice to live in hill country that Israel mostly settled in, and where the book of Judges mostly takes place.
Yes. Yeah, and Shechem, which figures very prominently in these stories, be up in that area.
Sure.
So a good deal of this is West Bank territory.
Absolutely.
You get new kinds of settlements there. Roughly, I suppose, 13th to 11th century, something like that, but over a couple of hundred years.
Yeah.
And these are typically unwalled settlements, new style of housing and so forth, but nothing to do with Egypt.
No, nothing to do with Egypt, and everything really to do with the Canaanite culture that was happening at the same time. But so none of this, what we were just talking about, which is sort of how we as academics reconstruct, I think, the start of Israel as a people or nation, none of that has anything to do with the books of Joshua and Judges, right? None of that's really represented there, except for the geographical center of the stories.
Sure. Yeah.
The stories, especially of Judges, take place right in this highland region where we saw these new settlements emerge in roughly around 1200. That's the only tie. Otherwise, the stories that we have in these books are, as I said, they're later attempts to try and make sense of the state of Israel.
Yeah.
Not, a little bit, yes.
Yeah, to
but
give an explanation of why are we here? Where did we come from?
yeah,
And it does so, in a very distinctive way of claiming that they were not indigenous. In many cultures, you'd want to claim you were indigenous, but also marked by ferocious antagonism to the people who were admittedly indigenous, or even other people who were claimants of the land, like the Philistines.
yeah. So I think a lot of what we're going to talk about over the next few sessions is some of the famous individual stories that treat exactly that tension of there were people here before, we seem to have eliminated them. Why did we do that? How did that happen? Who was left, even in stories of complete destruction? These are some of the main questions.
But what really makes the whole issue so interesting, I think, is there's a pretty good consensus now that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So why make up a story that didn't happen? And as we'll see, much of it now strikes us as offensive.
Yeah.
Much of it is now problematic for other reasons.
Yeah. Joshua and Judges are wonderful stories to look at for contemporary moral reflection.
Yeah.